and I will send everyone who registered with me the link afterwards. So I'm Terry Bridges. I teach physics and astronomy here at Okanagan College in Kelowna, BC. And we have 4 campuses in the Okanagan: Penticton, Kelowna, Vernon, and Salmon Arm. I'd like to start today by respectfully recognizing that I and my colleagues live and work on the traditional and unceded territories of the Silks Okanagan people and the Secwepemc Nation. And I think this land acknowledgement is really important today, as our discussion today will center around land, namely Maunakea. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event. We have students and instructors from the college, and so my students, great to see you. We also have astronomers and other interested folks from across Canada and outside Canada. Thank you all for taking part today. And please feel free to type in the chat where you're from, what First Nation or territory you're living in, if you know. I'd like to make this a short personal statement. I am an astronomer, and I've been privileged enough to observe with several telescopes on the top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii. It really is an amazing place, probably the best astronomical site in the world. So until a few years ago, I was pretty strong supporter of the TMT 30-meter telescope being built in Mauna Kea. I knew there was not unanimous consent from the Hawaiian community, particularly Native Hawaiians or the Kanaka Maoli. But I thought, okay, it's such an amazing site, we have to build a telescope there. But over the years, the ongoing resistance to TMT has made me change my mind. And I've come to the conclusion that the TMT should not be built on Mauna Kea at this time, because we don't have consent from the Hawaiian people. And I think we may never have that consent. So I know I'm going to learn a lot from our discussions today, and I hope that you will as well. So this is how it's going to work. I'll shortly introduce our 2 discussants, Kea and Hilding, who will have a pretty wide-ranging conversation about the TMT, Mauna Kea, and Indigenous resistance. They'll talk for about an hour. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So we'll be finishing at 5 o'clock our time, 8 o'clock Eastern time. Please feel free to type questions into the chat box, which I'll monitor and I'll collate, or you can ask them at the end in person. I know today's topic can arouse strong emotions, so I ask everyone to be respectful and considerate. If I see abusive, racist, or hateful comments in the chat, I'll remove that person from the event. And also, please keep your mics off unless you're speaking at the end. So I'd like to introduce our 2 discussants today. Kea Mele is a Kanaka Maoli scholar, activist, and practitioner from Maunawili, Oahu. He is an assistant professor of Indigenous politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and an affiliate faculty in the Center for Indigenous Studies and Center for the Study of the United States. He's currently working on a book manuscript, The Maunakea, Settler Colonial Capitalism and the Gifts of Sovereignty in Hawaii, that examines the historical development and contemporary relations of settler colonial capitalism in Hawaii and indigenous gifts of Hawaiian sovereignty that seek to overturn it by issuing responsibilities for balancing relationships with Aina, I'm probably mispronouncing that, the land and that which feeds us. Hilding Nielsen is Mi'kmaq and a member of the Kalapu First Nation in Newfoundland. He is a contract assistant professor in the David Dunlap Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the details of stellar physics in both sun-like stars and massive stars. At the same time, his work aims to indigenize astrophysics in Canada by creating space for indigenous cosmologies and worldviews, and by using indigenous methodologies to study astronomy. Okay, so I'm going to ask a few opening questions of Hilding and Kea, and then they will have a conversation. So my first question to both of you is, could each of you please tell us more about who you are, where you come from, and how you entered your field of study and work? I don't know who wants to go first, but.
Aloha, I can go first.
Okay.
Aloha mai kākou, o wau o Uahikea Maile, he Kanaka Hawaii au, he Kanaka Maoli au. No Maunawili mai au ma ka moku puni o Ahualua, I ka moku o Ko'olau Poko, I ke ahupua o Kailua. Haka, he polopeka vau I ke kulanui o University of Toronto, I ka Department of Political Science, mai takaranto mai. Maluna o na aina ea o na poe o iwi o Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Mississauga, Ame, Huron-Wendat. Nui ke aloha me ka mahalo no na poe o iwi o kia aina mo mona o ka dish with one spoon. Mahalo and velina kākou. So like Terry said, I am Dr. Kea Is, an Indigenous Politics professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Political Science. A little bit about myself is that I come from Mauna on the island of Oahu, which is in the district of Ko'olaupoko in the watershed or land division known as Kailua. Some of you may be familiar with Kailua Ahupua'a because it is a hot tourist attraction. And one of the beaches in this past decade was labeled the top or second best beach in the world. So there's a huge influx of tourists that come to Hawaii, to our island, to Kailua, and actually never know that Mauna is tucked into this Ahupua'a as well, because it's more close to the mountains. And so where I come from is near these particular beautiful beaches, but Mauka, towards the mountains in Mauna. I won't go too much into my research interests and specializations, as Terry's already outlined them, but I will talk a little bit more about who I am and where I'm from, now how I got to Toronto, I suppose. So I graduated from Kamehameha Schools, which is a school in Hawaii with multiple campuses. I graduated from Kapalama campus on Oahu. There's also a campus on Hawaii in Kea. And this school is specifically for Indigenous Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli, as we say in our language, Olelo Hawaii children. And after doing so, I left Hawaii to go to Pacific University and study economics and political science, and then to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was really trying to get all of the different kinds of ecosystems on my road trip in America. And I landed in the high desert at the University of New Mexico after finishing my master's degree in Oregon. And then a year and a half ago, I moved to Toronto, and I've been here for about a year and a half at the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto's St. George campus. And in this journey, I've learned a lot about my own family's involvement in Indigenous resistance, as Terry said, in particular in Hawaii. Both of my great-great-grandparents were anti-annexationists. And what that means is that they were involved in struggles on the ground in the late 19th century and early 20th century to refuse incorporation into the United States as members of the Hawaiian Kingdom's national citizenry, as also Kanaka Maoli. And so both my great-great-grandparents were involved in multiple parts of that struggle, and that's informed a lot of my research. It's informed what I teach. It's informed the way I see the world, and it's the mo'oku au hau, or succession of bone and genealogy, that animates me today. And so I'm really excited to kind of talk through more of what that means in relationship to astronomy, Canadian astronomy in particular at Maunakea, and even more specifically, the 30-meter telescope at Maunakea. I occupy a very unique position, I think, and I think a lot of other Canadian astronomers feel the same way, because I've been asked to talk to a lot of Canadian astronomers since moving to Toronto, not only as a scholar, as a community and cultural practitioner back home with my father and brother, but also as an activist that has organized and worked on multiple frontline struggles in Hawaii and elsewhere. And so I'm excited to engage with Terry's questions, and I really mahalo you for organizing all this, and for the Okanagan College to host this, for everyone being here, and also for Hilding for being in conversation with me. I've been so grateful to get to know Hilding at the University of Toronto. One of the first meetings I had with another faculty here was with Hilding in Sydney Smith Hall. And unfortunately, we can't meet in Sydney Smith Hall as intimately as we did then, but it's great to see him and to talk more specifically and engage his work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Hilding.
Thank you very much for having me. And it is too bad we can't meet in Sid Smith and have a coffee. As I said, my name is Sylvia Nelson. I'm an assistant professor at U of T, where I've been now for 6 years. My kind of path into astronomy started as an undergrad when I tried to get into engineering and couldn't make it work because scheduling courses was a problem. So I picked up an astronomy course and kind of fell in love with it ever since, and haven't stopped studying astronomy for 20 years now. As an Indigenous person from Newfoundland, it's kind of a different story than many Indigenous peoples in Canada. When Newfoundland and Labrador joined Confederation in 1949, one of the first parts of the agreement said there are no natives on the island, or to be more literal, no Indians in Newfoundland and Labrador. So my grandmother's identity was stripped from her. My father's identity was stripped from him, as were hundreds of others, or thousands of others. And in that time, our textbooks refer to us, the Mi'kmaq, as genociders, people who committed genocide against the Beothuk peoples, who are also in Newfoundland. They tried to tell us we don't exist. And it was only in the 1980s when the first First Nation bands gathered and started fighting for recognition and a place. First in Maunakea, or the Con River Mi'kmaq Band, and more recently on the western coast of the island, the Howloo First Nation that I'm a member of. For me, being Indigenous in Canada is very stressful, kind of different and stressful, in that I grew up in a very Western white kind of community, basically suburbia, and with very little connection to my heritage. So today, identifying as Indigenous for me means I have, I think, an obligation to create space in my field for other Indigenous peoples, because at this point, I am one of very few First Nation astronomers in Canadian astronomy, or physics for that matter. And so my goal in the last few years has been trying to create that space through learning, through teaching Indigenous knowledges, and through recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples on land. And I fully confess, like Terry, when I first heard of TMT, or I heard of TMT before it was TMT, I was a big fan of the idea of having a very large optical telescope, because it was going to revolutionize astronomy. This was before we even started having it on Maunakea. And even when it was moved to Maunakea or sited on Maunakea, I thought, we were told that, it was just a few people are against it. We'll consult, they'll come around. But since then, my opinion changed. It's just the resistance of the Kanaka Maoli has been incredibly moving, and a determination that is very hard to come to terms with for wanting the telescope. And I think if we respect sovereignty, we have to respect that opinion and that resistance. And so in recent years, my opinion has changed, especially, I think, like a lot of people, their hearts were broken when they saw the elders being arrested on Maunakea. And so I think we are at a place now where I think in Canadian astronomy, we can revisit our contribution to colonization of Maunakea. So I'll thank you, and I'll pass it back to Terry.
Great, thanks very much, both of you. It's wonderful to have you both here. Thank you again. So I asked Hilding if he would maybe put things in context a bit for us, to give us a bit of an overview of the TMT's history, how it's become associated with Maunakea, and the importance of the TMT in Canadian astronomy plans. So I don't know, Hilding, if you want to take a few minutes to do that, that would be great.
Sure. So I fully confess I'm not an expert on the history of TMT. Probably I know more about the Canadian biography of TMT. But I think it started in the 90s, the idea. And largely when the Keck telescopes, which are two 10-meter telescopes that are also on Maunakea, were constructed to benefit the Californian university system, they started talking about building an even bigger telescope. But at the same time, they wanted this new telescope. The Keck telescopes were trying to add smaller telescopes to the site, violating the agreement with the Hawaiian lease agreement, as well as violating environmental policy. And afterwards, it was kind of thought of that we were never going to build, astronomy would never build on Maunakea. So the idea was going to Chile to build a telescope, a very large optical telescope, that's what it was referred to, or at some points it was CELT, the Californian Extremely Large Telescope. Canada eventually became a partner, advocating for money. And as money sort of came in, donations and that, there were indications that the state of Hawaii was interested in having the telescope on Maunakea. And so even though this wasn't an original intention to go there, site testing began, and it became to develop the possibility at least in terms of the state of Hawaii, to build a telescope on Maunakea. Since then, in I guess the 2010s, under the conservative government, Canada agreed to contribute about $250 million. $250 billion would be a bit much. $250 million to this. Most of this money was designated for the construction of the observatory dome, which was a contract is a contractor on Vancouver Island, if I remember correctly. So even that contribution is about profiting a company. Since then, my understanding is that a lot of the issues have gone through various court cases, which have been, I think, very disastrous and very problematic, as well as ongoing consultations, as TMT would like to call it, and then the more recent protectors on the mountain blocking the roads. I think we've seen a very quiet growth of resistance that's come to the head as TMT has tried to begin construction. I think it's very hard to put a very proper history, at least from inside Canada, because most of our information came from Canadian representatives and representing TMT, not representing necessarily the Hawaiians or an outsider view. So I think historically our media was a bit skewed. So, probably not a complete history, but we didn't really do a very good job, I think, in the consultation process at any point, or listening at all. So, thank you.
Great, thanks. That gives us some good background. So I think you two have both already started on this question, but I'd like to explore a bit more. If you could, each of you, say what are your perspectives on TMT and astronomy on Maunakea, and how those perspectives have evolved with time. Now, I don't know if you have anything to add to what you've said already, but.
If it's okay with Hilding, I can take this, give him a break. Yeah, so I would like to talk a little bit about my perspective on, as the question you posed to us over email, Terry, asked, Maunakea in relationship to the 30-meter telescope, proposed construction, and also astronomy in general. I think it's important to note from the very beginning that the kind of techno-scientific network that has been built at Maunakea is very diffuse, as in, like Hilding said, there are multinational kind of consortiums that have been putting in money for this project, and this is consistent with many of the observatories already built at Maunakea. And these observatories are in many kind of dominant understandings of astronomy and astrophysics, scientific pursuits that use technological instrumentation that's really advanced for scientific inquiry in these fields, right? So there's a lot of moving parts in this network, right? There's actual complexes with instrumentation, with different kinds of instrumentation, not just telescopes, and there are different kinds of telescopes, radio telescopes, infrared optical telescopes. Currently, there are 13 observatories at the summit region of Maunakea in what's now called the Maunakea Science Reserve, and it's also labeled in a sub-designation an astronomy precinct in what the state of Hawaii has regulated now as a conservation district. And so there's an astronomy precinct in a conservation district that is labeled a Maunakea Science Reserve. And so I just want to say that to kind of preface my comments, because it's a little bit cacophonous and sort of confusing for folks that haven't been to Hawaii, don't know about this issue, haven't been to Maunakea. There are a lot of moving parts that I think are important to just ground folks on. So my perspective that I'd like to share tonight is this, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's evolved in this process. And I'll try my best to be brief. The 30-meter telescope, in my expert opinion, should not be built at TMT for 5 primary reasons. The first one is that Maunakea is overdeveloped. As I mentioned, there are already 21 telescopes and 13 observatories at Maunakea. There's a student telescope that's being proposed to be built currently. And like Hilding said, there have been other telescope add-ons that have been proposed and failed. And as we know, well, many of us know, the Canadian long-range plan has ranked the renovation of the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope high in its facility recommendation. So there's already a Canadian complex that is currently on Maunakea at the summit region. And this overdevelopment at Maunakea has actually come into a bit of a set of problems. And one of the sets of problems is that when these telescope observatories are proposed, they're also mandated to craft decommissioning protocol. And so there are some telescopes that are in their decommissioning protocol that actually, because of pollution, cannot match and meet and satisfy their decommissioning protocols and timelines. So the telescope observatory I'm thinking about is the Caltech Submillimeter telescope, which had a hydraulic fluid leak in its instrumentation and polluted its own concrete foundation, which complicated its decommissioning process. And so that telescope, which is sort of told is in decommissioning protocol, is not able to actually decommission in the timeline that it was proposed to. And so these projects of massive and small scale telescope observatories have environmental consequences that keep them from actually decommissioning, you know, really satisfying their own mandates, if you will. And so what in turn has happened is that development in the science reserve has actually already made a substantial and adverse impact on Maunakea's natural resources. And so this means that Maunakea's environmental resources and cultural resources, and this is sort of legal language from the state of Hawaii and court cases and decisions about the building permit in specific I'm thinking about. And so recently in 2018, as Hilding mentioned, the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii ruled that the conservation district use permit by the University of Hawaii applying on behalf of the 30-meter International Telescope Corporation, because the University of Hawaii holds the master lease on the Maunakea Science Reserve land from the state of Hawaii. So it has to apply for subleases on behalf of these corporations. So in 2018, the Supreme Court of Hawaii ruled in favor of UH and the TIO in authorizing its conservation district use permit. But I want to highlight one sort of tension that has gone without highlighting. In the majority opinion written by the court uses what's called a degradation principle to assert that there's already been an adverse significant impact on natural resources at Maunakea, so that Maunakea has been degraded previously, so much so that building the 30-meter telescope, which this conservation district use permit is applying for, would not cause the substantial adverse impact to natural resources. And so that's the justification that the majority opinion gave. However, in the dissenting opinion, the court argues against this degradation principle that essentially says it contravenes environmental norms, principles, and law, to suggest that in a conservation district, development that had previously accumulated substantial adverse impacts to natural resources would actually become a rationale to degrade those natural resources further. So the dissenting opinion was written by Justice Wilson in 2018, and it's gone slightly unhighlighted for obvious reasons in dominant discourse, but he highlights this really important point that it's akin to a rapacious logic of if an environment has been harmed and degraded so much in the past that it's okay to harm and degrade it more, right? And I emphasize the rapacious nature of this logic because what Justice Wilson is actually trying to get us to think about as well is the way in which that this can circulate as a kind of rape logic, right? That to harm someone in the past does not and should not ethically and morally and legally, according to state law in his argument, condone harming them further. And so I want to highlight that that's the kind of situation of how Maunakea is overdeveloped. Previously, it actually by the territorial government in 1901, I believe, it was geographically marked a wasteland. And now the hyper-industrialization continues via this kind of degradation logic that Justice Wilson was showing us. So the second reason why I think TMT shouldn't be built in my sort of expert perspective on this, as somebody who's been writing and researching astronomy industry development at Maunakea for some time now, is that Maunakea, the science reserve, is incredibly mismanaged. So I already kind of noted about how the University of Hawaii has the master lease over the Maunakea Science Reserve, and the Board of Land and Natural Resources regulates that master lease and the Maunakea Science Reserve. So these two one a state agency and one a public university in the state of Hawaii are severely mismanaging the Maunakea Science Reserve. And that should be a concern for everyone, astronomers, local people in Hawaii on Hawaii Island, and Kanaka, Maoli, Native Hawaiians alike. So in 1998 and 2005, there was a legislative audit of these two organizations that found severe mismanagement problems over the natural resources at Maunakea. And actually in 1997, there was an independent assessment of the TMT project. So before 2000, the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation contracted with the Keystone Institute, which is based out of Colorado, to do a risk assessment of the TMT being sited at Maunakea. And the report in 1997, paid for by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, actually suggested that there was legal confusion, bureaucratic ambiguity, and a vacuum in leadership, all related to the ways in which the state and the University of Hawaii have become entangled in this mess that even today, they're trying to create and implement rules to satisfy an audit that happened 15 years ago. And so what this has resulted in is a bevy of lawsuits, as Hilding pointed out, and two in particular that I want to highlight, which are really important and are still pending and waiting decisions currently, which adds to the level of inauthority the state has to pursue this project currently and in the near future. The first lawsuit is by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and they've just recently this year in March asked for a summary judgment on this case, which hasn't come from the judge. And the lawsuit alleges that the state has failed to manage the ceded lands that the Maunakea Science Reserve sits on at Maunakea, right? So there's a lot of like topographical jurisdictions that I'm talking about. And so I'm trying to track that for you all to kind of understand. But Maunakea is a part of the Ceded Lands Trust that the state of Hawaii manages as a public land trust. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. So OHA's filing a lawsuit saying that the state has failed its trust responsibility in these ceded lands. The second lawsuit is by a few cultural practitioners represented by the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation, and it's a lawsuit over the state and the Department of Hawaiian Homeland's mismanagement of Maunakea's access road, actually. And it zeroes in on the access road because this is where a police barricade was erected and then a blockade of indigenous elders of Hawaii, or as we call in our language, kupuna. And so a lot of people don't know that there was actually a police barricade behind our blockade at Maunakea Access Road. And so we, as Kanaka Maoli, weren't allowed to access past the police barricade. And that's typically not talked about a lot in the public discourse still. Nevertheless, this lawsuit alleges that the state, despite building a road, Maunakea Access Road, on Hawaiian homelands, did not actually satisfy the contractual obligations to acquire the land beneath the road. So the land beneath the road did not get legally transferred to the Department of Transportation in the state of Hawaii to build the road on top of that land. And so the jurisdiction over Maunakea Access Road is being adjudicated in this lawsuit, which is incredibly important for thinking about these 33 arrests of our indigenous elders, right? All Native Hawaiian beneficiaries of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands who have a right to their Hawaiian land in federal legal statute. And so this is a case that we should follow very astutely, but also the OHA case as well. The third reason is that Maunakea is seized land, not ceded land. There's a reason why the title of this conversation is referencing how Maunakea is unceded territory. I think this is something that in Canadian sort of dominant discourse you hear, especially when considering what has been taking place at the unceded territory at Wet'suwet'en. Also thinking about other sorts of territorial struggles on unceded land, Sekapuemic, and also what's taking place in Caledonia right now with 1492 land back lane and Six Nations Haudenosaunee claims to land that a housing developer is attempting to build on. So unceded territory is also a thing in Hawaii. And I want to explain it just as fast as I can. The astronomy precinct is in the Maunakea Science Reserve, and that's sitting on the ceded lands that the state manages. Well, those ceded lands were actually illegally seized and stolen from the Hawaiian Kingdom's government and Kanaka Maoli people in the late 19th century. This was territory that belonged to the crown of the Hawaiian Kingdom's constitutional monarchy. It was called Crown Land. It's actually called King's Land before. And then later, when a white Euro-American oligarchy of businessmen, lawyers, and capitalists that were attempting to really pounce on the trade of sugar and then later pineapple, they overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom's government and infiltrated its state apparatus. They called themselves the Provisional Government, then the Republic of Hawaii, when Grover Cleveland refused to acknowledge they were a legitimate government. And in doing so, they also usurped the national lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom, including the Crown lands and the government lands, which is about 2 million acres of territory in Hawaii. And so this white Euro-American republic appealed to the US federal government to be incorporated, which later President William McKinley did, needing a coaling station in the Pacific to fight in Guam and the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. So although in 1897, a treaty was never ratified by Senate, right? There's never been a treaty of annexation that's actually been ratified by the Senate. It failed in 1897. Congress passed a joint resolution, a domestic piece of legislation to annex Hawaii, which international legal experts say does not have authority to do. It, as Keanu Sai, who's an international legal expert and indigenous politics professor, says, it would be like Great Britain trying to annex the United States, or the United States trying to annex Japan through a domestic piece of legislation, which is what happened in the late 19th century. And so those lands were then transferred by the white Euro-American government to the federal government, which then in the middle of the 20th century created the state of Hawaii and delegated its management of the 2 million acres. And then the state of Hawaii created the Maunakea Science Reserve. And now you see where I'm going, that Maunakea is unceded territory. It was seized, but not ceded by the Hawaiian Kingdom's government and the Hawaiian people. And actually, this has been affirmed in public law, signed by former President Bill Clinton in this apology resolution, where he says that the indigenous people of Hawaii have never relinquished their territorial sovereignty over their national lands, including Maunakea. There's also no indigenous consent beyond the kind of lack of relinquishing title and authority over national lands to the occupying government, to the US, and to now the state of Hawaii. Opposition against TMT uses these national claims to territory, saying that Maunakea is unceded land. But also, in 2019, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination penned a letter to the state of Hawaii and the US rapporteur for that committee that recognized there is no free, prior, informed consent that's been obtained from indigenous people of Hawaii for TMT. So at an international level, the United Nations is investigating this matter, recognizing that consent by the people hasn't been obtained. Recently, there have been quite a number of polls and surveys that have attempted to suggest that Native Hawaiians or the people of Hawaii support TMT at Maunakea. And in fact, a 2019 December survey refuted those polls and their claims. A group of HPU researchers with a Native Hawaiian survey polled about 1,000 Native Hawaiians, self-identified Native Hawaiians, which was a much larger sample size than former polls that were sponsored by the TIO and done in the state of Hawaii had, and asked participants, Native Hawaiian participants, if they support the 30-meter telescope at Maunakea. And so this HPU survey result came back and showed 88% of Native Hawaiians surveyed do not support the 30-meter telescope. This is an incredible poll because it not only refutes the former polls, but it also asks specifically Native Hawaiians and Native Hawaiians from Hawaii Island, from the Big Island, that are most directly affected by astronomy industry development. So it's an incredible poll to pay attention to. And lastly, on this point, some will say that, oh, well, in 2009, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which is a state agency that was created from a constitutional convention in 1978, it has 20% of the revenues and sale monies from the Ceded Lands Trust allocated to it for the betterment of Native Hawaiians. This is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. It's sort of our representative body, but it's still a state body. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs supported the siting of TMT at Maunakea. And so a lot of astronomers and a lot of folks look to that resolution to suggest that consent was obtained, that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs provided consent. It's a legitimate, recognizable political body that represents Native Hawaiians, and it consented to the siting of Maunakea. Well, consent can change. In 2015, after a wave of vigils and opposition in 2014, stopping the groundbreaking ceremony, creating a bit of infrastructure at Hale Pohaku, the Maunakea Visitor Center, to stop TMT construction crews, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs listened and changed their mind and actually passed without opposition a resolution that rescinded its support. So currently, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs does not support the 30-meter telescope at Maunakea, and recently publicly corrected a TMT advisory committee called Caltech here in the Canadian astronomy context for suggesting that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs currently supports TMT. And in refutation, suggested to not only the Caltech committee, but also Acura and Casca that the record be set straight and that it be shown that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs does not support TMT's sighting at Maunakea at the Northern Plateau. And I think this is really important for us to think about because there are serious consequences for this kind of action by the Canadian astronomy community, consequences for violations of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Article 8, which is about propaganda, trying to influence a community about another community, particularly an indigenous community, and Article 32, which is about development and free, prior, and informed consent. You know, these declarations, these articles from UNDRIP should be taken seriously, not just in jest and in gesture, but in reality, because they affect not just indigenous people, but they affect other people as well. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over, I know this wasn't very brief, I tried, is that the TMT will require, in order to be built at Mauna Kea, it will require further police and military force. The long-range plans, facility recommendations suggested that it would not condone force to build facilities that Canada is invested in. And I want to stress this point because in order for TMT to be built, more police and military force will be required. On July 17th, 2019, about a year ago, I saw firsthand how the state, its police, the US military, through the Army National Guard, engaged Kanaka Maoli. I was there when 33 elders were arrested. I was there on the side of Maunakea Access Road as my people were detained and thrown into paddy wagons, but not just any people, elders. Some were 90 years old and in wheelchairs. Police had to wheel my relatives into paddy wagons. This is the engagement that the state is willing to perform to open Maunakea Access Road and to allow TMT to be built. And it would require more riot batons. It would require tactical gear. It would require a sound cannon, which was directly in front of my face. I don't know if you've ever seen a sound cannon in person, but this one was actually very sophisticated and it's much smaller than I imagined. But with one twist of a knob, your eardrums could be blown. It could be very, very dangerous and harmful. They arrested 33 of our elders that day, and I saw, but they also threatened to come down harder in months later. This is a story that most people read about, have heard about, but haven't felt. And it's important to note those feelings even now, a year and a half later, because astronomy, Canadian astronomy, shouldn't require the arresting of Indigenous elders, shouldn't require a sound cannon to answer research questions about exoplanets. We should be concerned about life on our planet. And in particular, in a state and nation like Canada, we should be concerned about reconciling with Indigenous peoples, and that police and military violence is not reconciliation. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So Hilda, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that question, or do you two want to get into a conversation with other questions?
We can get into conversation. Perhaps you, Kea, can ask one of his questions, and then he could get a small break.
Yeah, that sounds good. I really loved, Hilding, your community paper, right? As you said, not a white paper because of the legacy of white papers and the kind of creation of Indian Aboriginal law in Canada and the kind of sour history that has been produced through Canadian white papers. So I really loved your community paper that you wrote with colleagues about indigenizing astronomy and as a part of the collection of feedback for the long range plan community. And so I'd love to hear more from you about what indigenizing astronomy means, and perhaps why it's important and an important obligation for specifically the Canadian astronomy community.
Yeah, I think to start off, in general, indigenizing and supporting indigeneity support for every community in this country. I mean, if we pretend to believe in truth reconciliation, then we have to at least try. But for me in astronomy, it comes down to, it's hard to see too many stars from Toronto. But if you walk outside, you see a few and you think, I recognize that constellation. Maybe it's the Big Dipper, maybe it's Orion. But why isn't it Muon? Why isn't it the Great Bear from Cree stories? What is the Haudenosaunee story? The stars reflect the land for for many nations in this country or in the US. And so I think one reason it's important is because we're on native land, we're on indigenous territories, no matter where we are. And the sky reflects that. So we should be able to look up and remember where we are. I think it's also important because I think, just to borrow the academic diatribe about diversity and inclusion, there are so few indigenous people in STEM in Canada. That's a legacy that is ridiculous. We should be welcoming, we should be engaging, we should be learning from these people, from indigenous peoples. And so I think we need to indigenize to create space for a new generation of students and elders. I think we need to respect the land, and we need to learn from the knowledges. Indigenous knowledge can offer so much. How many journalists and newspaper articles say scientists discover something indigenous people already knew, as if we can discover something already known. And then I keep thinking, the Anishinaabe talk about heartberry stars, variable red supergiant stars, we would say in Western society. So there are generations and generations of observations and understanding that offers greater contribution. So I think it's a bit of all of that. And, astronomy is not just Aristotle to Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's a lot of nations and a lot of peoples in this world have their astronomies and their own understanding. And we need that. So I think for me, it's really part of being on the land and being on this land as well. So perhaps, would you like me to ask you a question? We'll go back and forth that way, or you have a continuation?
Could I just ask one follow-up?
Sure.
Something I'm curious about. We've talked a little bit about your courses that you teach at the University of Toronto, and maybe you can share a little bit about this new course that you developed that you've taught about sort of Indigenous astronomy, and perhaps there's someone out there that would be interested in taking your course. And so
hopefully. So I've been teaching introductory courses on Indigenous astronomies for primarily first-year students. So in their first terms, it's like 20 students. And we basically go through different issues and stories. And we, in the Mi'kmaq, we have the story of Muon and the seven bird hunters. And that's a story told throughout the year. So, we learn the motion of the sky, the stars, and how it connects to us, and how it connects to the land and the cycles of say, the bear, hibernation and hunting. And so students sort of have to engage into astronomy through story, as opposed to the traditional path of mathematics or jargon. And we get a different perspective. So students have to understand it's not all the same logic, not all the same picture. I've also more recently been teaching a graduate course on astronomy and colonization, where we try to explore issues like TMT, but we also explore ideas of what it would mean to decolonize. I'm sorry to use the buzzword, but it's the easiest one to do, to decolonize astronomy or to be more inclusive, and having astronomers who are almost entirely less white, to be honest, sort of engage with our responsibility as settlers in these communities and to do better. I'm very much hoping, in the next few years, we can develop an even more senior course in astronomy that focuses more on the ethics of astronomy. As I think the story of TMT and all these issues, as you mentioned about use of force, and I'm thinking about how are we even being ethical And we traditionally, as a culture, astronomy culture, don't even really think of ethics because we're just looking up, right? We're using telescopes. We're benevolent. We're the good guys. And I think we need to have a more deeper reflection of what it means to serve humanity, what it means to be respectful of people on the land. And so that, you know, I've been developing these things as well. So I guess from my perspective, I'd like to ask you, we talk about astronomy on Mauna Kea through a very Western lens, you know, I think you refer to it as a techno-science. You know, and we like also to quote the Hawaiian Kingdom as being lovers of astronomy and wanting to embrace telescopes as sort of justification for TMT, even though it was just a small telescope on a beach. What would a Hawaiian-led astronomy and science might look like to you?
It's a great question, Hilding. I was really excited that you asked this, sort of like thought about this, and we're gonna have a chance to talk about it. There's two really important things that I wanna like respond with. So first, the quotation that Hilding is asking about is a quotation from the former king of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Kalakaua. He was the first democratically elected mo'i, or ruler of the Hawaiian Kingdom in our language. And in 1873, he made these remarks in relationship to explorers transiting across the world to map the transit of Venus. And so King Kalakaua was saying these comments about the effort to track the transit of Venus and accommodate foreign explorers, because King Kalakaua himself was very interested in modern science and the kind of ways in which it disidentified with Hawaiian forms of science and celestial observation. He helped to resurrect a secret society that this was sort of one of the objectives, was to think about sort of modern forms of science and Hawaiian forms of science together and how they fit and they don't. And that was called the Hale Naua. So he resurrected it around this time during what we call a Hawaiian Renaissance period. So when folks were coming to Hawaii to track Venus transiting across the face of the sun, he said, quote, "It will afford me unfeigned satisfaction if my kingdom can add its quota toward the successful accomplishment of the most important astronomical observation of the present century and assist, however humbly, the enlightened nations of the earth in these costly enterprises," end quote. So I actually want to make an argument that this quotation has proliferated amongst proponents of the 30-meter telescope, astronomers all over the world, because of the master lease that the University of Hawaii composed and published in 2000. The cover page of the master lease has 3 quotations that don this cover page. One of the 3 quotations is this one by King Kalakaua, right? In the dominant discourse, the quotation is taken up as a kind of way to suggest that Kalakaua would support TMT because of his ideas about astronomy in the context of the transit of Venus. Well, as Hilding said, he was supportive of a few portable telescopes that were not extremely large telescopes, and they were set up in Honolulu, not at Maunakea. And so it's quite presumptuous to suggest that our king, our ali'i, one of our rulers, would support the 30-meter telescope now. I want to say 2 other things and then answer this question very specifically. First, on the master plan cover sheet, a second quotation is by Frederick Chapman. And he was a director of one of the telescope observatories at Maunakea. And the quotation remarks about sort of the way in which modern astronomers are brothers and sisters with ancient Hawaiians who have cultural traditions related to celestial observation, right? And so that's where the rhetoric kind of injects itself into how astronomy as a kind of cultural tradition is used to justify the 30-meter telescope project. But researchers like a dear friend of mine and Kanaka Maoli scholar, Iokepa Kasumbo Salazar, have argued this is a fictive kinship, right? It marks indigenous Hawaiians as politically sort of in the past and disappearing ancient Hawaiians so that modern astronomers can sort of stake a claim at Maunakea, right? This is literally a master plan for how the University of Hawaii can manage and develop the Maunakea Science Reserve. And that actually, Iokepa Kasumbo Salazar says that it's possible through only the disavowal of Kanaka Maoli indigeneity and our political status and our relationship to that territory, which is a relationship of sort of sovereign jurisdiction, as I've already talked about, which then fetishizes indigenous Hawaiian people, bodies, and language, right? So then you see how King Kalakaua enters into this equation, right? He himself, as a ruler, and this quotation that he said can be maximized symbolically without materially attending to the context. And so he calls this a process of fictive kinship. It's an amazing article. It's published in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal, published just 2 or 3 years ago, I want to say. The third quotation is actually a quotation from Mary Kavena Pukui, who is my relative. And she authored a book of Olelo no Eau, or Hawaiian proverbs and sayings, wise sayings. And this one that's on the master plan cover page is about Maunakea. It's Maunakea Kuahivi, Maunakea Kuahivi Kuha'o I Kamalia. And it basically gets misinterpreted and then kind of adorns the master plan as Maunakea standing alone in the calm. But actually, the word kuha'o can also mean standing independent. And so I want to remind everyone that this is an issue of sovereignty, jurisdiction, contestation over land, right? And even a quotation in Hawaiian like that can be decontextualized and then used symbolically to suggest all sorts of things about the development of 30-meter telescope. So what does Hawaiian-led astronomy and Hawaiian science look like? Well, there are certainly Hawaiian scientists that do kind of dominant forms of, as Hilding said, Western astronomy and astrophysics. And there are Hawaiian cultural practitioners that do science and astronomy that isn't exactly classified as science and astronomy for particular ideological reasons, right? It doesn't match sort of the dominant hegemonic methods of astronomy or astrophysics. But the truth is, there are a lot of Hawaiian astronomers and scientists that are not in leadership positions in the kind of current management of the Maunakea Observatory industry. And so I'll give you an example. The Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii is hiring a new director. There's no native Hawaiian candidate to be a director for the Institute for Astronomy. So what would Hawaiian-led astronomy and science look like at Maunakea? Well, in some sense, it would look like the director being native Hawaiian. And actually, 2 of the candidates have significant ties in the Canadian astronomy community. One of them is the current director of the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope and actually sits on different bureaucratic seats of power in the management of the Maunakea Science Reserve. But they're also not represented, Native Hawaiians are not represented in the Maunakea Observatory industry. If you look at the 2018 Gender and Diversity Survey that was published, you will find that over 60% of the workers that are either in STEM fields or not are white. And many of them are white folks that have not grown up in Hawaii. 62%. There's only 6% that are Native Hawaiian. So a Native Hawaiian-led industry would have equal representation, right? But it does not. The last thing I'll say is that Hawaiian astronomy and science was happening at Maunakea last July at Pu'uhonu o Pu'uhuluhulu, which was the place of refuge and sanctuary that supported the main blockade at Maunakea Access Road. And a lot of our cultural leaders and leaders in protocol at the blockade were Native Hawaiian astronomers and scientists. So one in particular is Pualani Kanahele, who is a leader in a nonprofit called Papaku Makavalu, which arguably is a very scientific organization that deals in the deconstruction and reconstruction of the universe as a school of traditional Hawaiian thought. She was at Maunakea, and she was teaching us about their methods that are arguably scientific and also not quite, because they are Hawaiian, but they're not recognized and valued as scientific or astronomical. Pualani Kanahele was arrested as one of the elders on July 17th. So a Native Hawaiian cultural practitioner, scientist, and astronomer in her own right, practicing customary tradition at the base of Mauna Kea without using the telescopes and observatories, was not allowed to practice her own culture and religion and customs, and in fact arrested for doing so. And so we know what it looks like to be led by Kanaka Maoli that are scientists, that are astronomers, and that use indigenous Hawaiian epistemology and ontology, and are excluded from being included as scientists or astronomers. This isn't new to us. What is very emergent, though, is that we are criminalized and our elders are arrested for attempting to teach their people about these forms of knowledge production that don't require colonialism, that don't require capital, that don't require the conquest of land for the conquest of new frontiers in the universe.
Thank you very much. That's a lot to take in, and I kind of hope one day I get the opportunity to learn some of that astronomy from your elder. And it is science. There's no doubt. No one should be denying that. Perhaps, would you like to ask questions? I think you
yeah, sure.
Winded yourself a little there.
I did. You know, I'd like to hear from your own perspective more about sort of not the class that you're teaching about astronomy and colonization per se, but this idea that Terry has kind of pitched us about and sort of organizing this panel. And I want to honor the fact that this was sort of his idea that he thought about for our, that now has transpired into this conversation. And the idea is astro-colonialism. And I'm just curious, in your own words, what does astro-colonialism sort of stand for, mean to you, and how can Canada rectify its participation in astro-colonialism?
Thank you. That's a good question. There's so many ways. I think you espoused one momentarily where we use science, where we define one science and ignore indigenous knowledges because it is not, quote unquote, non-scientific. That is colonization in the simplest terms in my mind. I think we talk about colonization a lot when we speak about space exploration. We send Matt Damon to Mars and rescue him. We're talking about colonizing Mars. We're talking about how we're going to build settlements, and it's all about taking land in the same respect. I think one of my colleagues has written very strongly about light pollution as colonization as well. You think about how many indigenous stories are written in the stars. And if you're living in Toronto or another urban area, you can't see half the stars, so your stories are being erased. That's another, I think, form. But I think probably what you're getting at strongly is how we use our facilities. And I think historically in Canada, we built, our first telescopes were in Ontario primarily, first major telescopes. And then we built one in Victoria that was colonizing Indigenous land there. And then, in the 1960s, we wanted something like the Canada, France, Hawaii telescope. And we originally was going to be built in British Columbia, if I remember correctly, but it was moved to Maunakea after the lease agreement came into place. And we benefit from that colonization because, as you noted rightfully, as unceded land, we treated it as state land. We treated it as being taken land. And we benefit from that colonization. So as soon as we put something on that land, when we get an image, that image is taken from someone else's land, from Indigenous territory. So when I publish a paper based on that image, I'm colonizing. And it's kind of creepy how that works, because in Canada, one of my colleagues, he looks around the publications for that year and compiles which telescopes have the most publications. And Canada, France, Hawaii telescope is one of the most productive telescopes in the world. So we every day we take data, we are benefiting from that colonization. We're benefiting from taking of the land in Hawaii. Likewise, when we do so, I think in the Dominion Radio Astrophysical Observatory, the Very Large Array in southern US, Kitt Peak, telescopes in Chile. And so that is our colonization. Our telescopes are a way of framing sort of jurisdiction, framing our right to be there, our nativism as astronomers, and we benefit. And the worst part about this is that this is our currency. The number of publications is academic currency. The number of grants is academic currency. If we didn't have these telescopes, we wouldn't necessarily have the same records, same results. We would not be competitive. So not only are we benefit, but this is our capitalism. This is how we essentially profit as academics. So not only is it colonization, it's a form of capitalism that we're winning, or that we're taking. And it's very hard, I find. I think in Canadian astronomy, you cannot actually work unless you really benefit from some form of colonization on these lands. We're so wedded to Canada, France, Hawaii telescope. We're so wedded to the Gemini telescope on Mauna Kea, or the Gemini telescope in Chile, that if you refuse to use these telescopes, it'll impact your career. What do I say to students who want to do a proposal on Canada, France, Hawaii telescope? Do I say no because I'm not going to colonize? How am I helping them? Or even in bigger projects, I actually confess that I have to admit I'm a member of the science teams for the Maunakea Spectroscopic Explorer. I would rather be the Spectroscopic Explorer somewhere where it's wanted, or somewhere where that it fits in within a non-colonizing thing. But if I'm not part of this team, I don't have a voice in Canadian astronomy. And I have something on my record that I lose some currency. So even just to be an astronomer in Canada, you sort of have to be part of that sort of culture, that colonizing culture, and you have to live it. And I think and there are a couple of Canadian astronomers who are around these telescopes and are Indigenous, and we have to sort of figure out how to balance that. And it's kind of I personally find it kind of a disgusting proposition. What's right and what's wrong, but that is what astronomy is. We are about this kind of colonization and having these telescopes, and our telescopes are not going to be any smaller. I mean, if we ever build a 30-meter telescope, either on Mauna Kea or in Canary Islands or somewhere else, very quickly someone will have a plan for a 100-meter telescope. We have a very large radio array. If you remember the movie Contact, that's so many dishes. Now we want to build a square kilometer radio telescope. And so our appetite is never going to be satiated, and that's also something we need to contend with.
I have a follow-up because I think this is like really important, and especially in the context of the question I asked, but then thinking also about its relationship to the long-range plan facility recommendations, right? So the long-range plan September released facility recommendations, ranks a very large optical telescope / the 30-meter telescope as the #1 priority. And in the same document contains some language about creating guiding principles to consult with indigenous peoples where these facilities are constructed and to obtain consent according to not just the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also, as you mentioned earlier, the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I guess I wonder, what does that say to you that in the long range plan facility recommendations, there's a recommendation for the 30-meter telescope on one hand, but on the other, there's a recommendation for guiding principles in consultation and obtaining consent with indigenous people. What does that say to you?
Yeah. So I don't want to speak for the authors, but I think the thing that needs to be noted is the long range plan is as a document, it is about compromise. It has to reflect all voices in Canada and to be approved. And I think if any author had just said no TMT on Maunakea, the document probably would have been thrown out because there are Canadian astronomers who still support it in senior positions. So I think what it means to me is I see this as a bit of a glimmer of hope, ironically enough, in that I don't know how you're going to get consent for TMT on Maunakea without actually cheating and manufacturing it. And so my personal feeling is that this sort of, if we accept the recommendation about consent and free prior form consent or whichever legal framework we want to use, that I think that means that, you know, we have to accept right now that we can't continue with TMT in its current form. And I think, and the other part of that I also want to add is the document also clearly notes about force. We don't define what force means, but I think that's also very important because I think that both of those things, and as you know, we'll never get TMT without military force. And I totally believe you. In that is that I don't see how we're ever going to do it that way. And I think we're basically saying is that at least we're putting up conditions where TMT cannot be built or conditions have to be met for TMT can be built. It's not, I think the previous 10-year plan, which was written in 2010, sort of wrote TMT as TMT and Maunakea or bust. And I think now that we're creating, or at least we're trying to create some sort of ethical standards. And I think within those ethical standards, we cannot build TMT on Maunakea. I would also kind of note, I think the report notes that TMT is currently as most advanced on Maunakea, but I think the report clearly, or I shouldn't say clearly, but does try to note that we would be, that the Canadian community would be happy with TMT anywhere, which I think is also a positive change because there was a very strong commitment previously to Maunakea that against the wishes of the Kanaka Maoli. So I take it as a bit of a positive step forward. I think the biggest issue now is how do we define consent, or the conditions for consent, and how do you define the conditions for force? And again, that's probably going to end up being some compromise between various parties involved. And I'm hoping for the best, but I think it's still a long way from being clear what that means. Shall I ask a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, folks, also, since we are at sort of 4:45 our time, just if you do want to, maybe if we do want to take up some questions from, there's some questions in the chat, but not sure. So Hildy, yeah, why don't you go ahead and ask?
So I think the follow-up I would have is the TMT External Relations Vice President, that's a mouthful, Gordon Squires, kind of noted to CBC that consent in Hawaii is a complex issue, as there is no single recognized decision-making authority for the native Hawaiian population. And I think you've very clearly noted there are a lot of complex issues with respect to Maunakea. But I'm always confused. Is consent, do you think the consent or the more easily put, the lack of consent really that complex for astronomers? Like, are we kind of muddying the waters, do you think, or and how?
That's a great question. Yeah. So if I'm thinking about is the astronomy community, the Canadian astronomy community, maybe in specific, but the kind of larger astronomy community that is concerned and involved in this project, muddying the waters about consent. I tend to read a lot of the internal documents to see what is being constructed about consent and how consent's being framed, how it's used as a discourse, right? That draws certain kinds of forms of power in its construction. And I think that a great example of how the waters are being muddied is in the sort of information packet that the Caltech committee put together in October 2019. So there's this internal document that is sort of facing the Canadian astronomy community to inform folks about what's going on at Maunakea with the 30-meter telescope and the investment in it by Canada, and also sort of informing people about the progress, right? And so it's a document for the community, but it's publicly accessible. In it, it says that in 2009, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs passed a resolution, or a motion actually, that supported the siting of Maunakea. And in the Caltech document in October 2019, closely reading this information packet, it itself argues that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is a legitimate political entity that is recognizable as representing Native Hawaiians. And because of that legitimate recognition and representative power on behalf of Native Hawaiians, the Caltech October 2019 document suggests that Native Hawaiians consent to TMT, and quite explicitly suggests that consent on behalf of Native Hawaiians had been obtained in 2009. But I've talked with a lot of Canadian astronomers in the past year, and I know that you all are incredibly smart and strategic. And so I can sniff out a omission of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs 2015 motion that rescinded the support for the 30-meter telescope. So the document constructs a narrative, right, about what consent is, who can give consent, and how that consent is sort of temporalized, right? It was granted in 2009. It currently, because we're not talking about the 2015 motion to rescind support, it currently supports TMT. That to me is a kind of attempt to manufacture consent. And also, I think it should be taken very seriously because of the ways in which the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples quite clearly discusses violations of Indigenous peoples' rights internationally through propaganda used to influence a group of people about an Indigenous population, and also the way that consent is being framed, which actually is just a falsity and a lie. And so you see the Office of Hawaiian Affairs literally publicly comment on this Caltech document, saying that that is untrue. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs official position, and if it's an official position which the Caltech document suggests is legitimate and recognizable as representative of Native Hawaiians, OHA, in response, very recently, I think in September, said that our official position is we do not support the siting of Maunakea at TMT. And some people will say in response, oh, their official position is neither for citing TMT at Maunakea nor against it. But that public correction should clarify that there is no affirmative consent given by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And it's already been recognized in Canadian astronomy circles as legitimate and recognizably representative. And that is how consent has been muddied. And using the rhetoric and discourse and narrative of the Canadian astronomy community, you can see how this is actually false. And the Office of Hawaiian Affairs corrected the record, saying that they do not support the TMT at Maunakea.
I think if I can follow up on that briefly, think it's a very strong argument, but one of the, let's say, the things that astronomers like to say is, oh, there's so many voices, so many Hawaiian voices, all things considered, so we need to consult more and more. Is there, at what point is consultation just harassment to you?
You know, in this case, I think that there's been enough consultation represented as a kind of consent that we can suggest that it is harassment, or maybe what some would say beating a dead horse. You know, I don't like that, but it's sort of what comes to mind right now. You know, when a state agency like the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is publicly correcting another country's sort of internal Canadian astronomy community documentation, there's something up. And the continuous attempts to try to prove that polls suggest Native Hawaiians support TMT or that it's split totally just obfuscates the material realities of the situation, right? Whether it's sort of OHA's lack of consent, or the fact that a lot of the surveys and polls done by the Ward Research Institute, which suggests that Hawaiians are split, that the state of Hawaii citizenry supports TMT, they're not actually sampling Native Hawaiians, and they're receiving monies from the corporation. And this is a corporate project. It isn't a scientific research study or survey, like, for instance, the Native Hawaiian survey, which was done by political scientists at Hawaii Pacific University, and specifically sampled Native Hawaiians that self-identified, and the sample size was higher than the Ward research polls were. So like, these are the material realities of the situation. And I think that the impulse to continue to try to get consent or to manufacture it illustrates the difficulty of, in this case, non-Indigenous peoples attempting to railroad Indigenous consent and rights, to refuse consent in order to develop a project that, as you said, Hilding, can benefit a group of people through research publications, through grant monies, through all sorts of academic capital. And we're seeing that railroading continues and continues. But in Hawaii, we know that when push comes to shove, we will do what is necessary to stop the construction of the 30-meter telescope, because we know what the facts are, and we know what our relationship is to Maunakea, and we know what the legal history is over jurisdiction at Maunakea as well.
Maybe I'll just, there's I think a relevant question that was in the chat from Grant Hill. Fundamental question: what constitutes consent? All scientific polls have shown the Hawaiian community is split pretty much 50-50. The 88% number was not a scientific poll. So is consent 100%, 50.1%? Who gets to decide this? Who gets to vote? I don't know if either of you want to comment on that, or?
I'll just say, I think I just answered that, and Hilding was asking me about that already. And the constant refrain to try to find consent and try to get consent in the face of the lack of consent tells you a lot about how genuine the consultation process is and what people really think about consensual relationships.
Okay. So I guess in terms of, we have a little bit of time left. I'm just looking at the chat. So there were some questions about decommissioning, how long would it take? And I think those are probably answered in terms of the current master lease expires in 2033. There's plans to renew the lease. Then Alex Hills made an interesting connection with Canadian mining companies operating overseas, especially in Central America. But there's and there's a discussion about as Caltech publicly responded to the public correction, and then there was comments there wasn't publicly recognized by the long range panel. There's a question from Pat Hall for Kea. I don't know if you can see the chat there. This is one of the very last questions.
Yeah, I can see it. So the question is, suppose that TMT abandons efforts to build on Maunakea and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs accepts a role in Maunakea Science Reserve governance. What would you foresee for the future of observatories and astronomy research on Maunakea? I'll take a cue actually from something Ray Carlberg and I talked about previously. Ray Carlberg is at the University of Toronto, and I believe he's on this call. And it's something that he mentioned to me that Kealoha Pishoda, who is a former worker in the Maunakea observatory industry and Kanaka Maoli cultural practitioner and legal advocate who has stopped working in the Maunakea observatory industry and actually launched efforts legally to block construction in courts for the 30-meter telescope. And she said to Ray, and Ray relayed to me that something that was very profound, right? These telescope observatories, like Hilding said, have had very productive lives and have allowed researchers all over the world, researchers that have never even stepped foot on Hawaii or on the northern plateau of Mauna Kea, the summit region of Mauna Kea, to benefit and progress not just their research, but these ideas about Enlightenment science and the search for origins and biosignatures in other solar systems on other planets. And it's had a good run. And so Kealoha Pishoda is saying, like, it's been a good run. And in reiterating that, Ray had mentioned to me that it's been a good run and it should run its course. And we should hold the state and the University of Hawaii accountable for the time being. And also the hypothetical of if the Office of Hawaiian Affairs accepted a role in Mauna Kea Science Reserve governance, what would you foresee for the future of observatories and astronomy research on Mauna Kea? I think that that would be a very difficult sell for astronomers all over the world and for citizens of the state of Hawaii, settlers in Hawaii, to allow that. And I think that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs would become under attack, if I'm quite honest, for stepping into a governance role, which tells you a lot about the kind of anti-Indigenous rhetoric surrounding situations where Indigenous people are taking control of authority and the way in which non-Indigenous people perceive that taking control of their own authority as a threat. And I believe that that would be a very difficult process to be accomplished. And so it's hard for me to say an answer.
So we are at the hour-and-a-half mark. So it's probably a good time to wrap up. Do either of you have any final comments or statements you'd like to make? Or if you said everything you want to say?
Hilding?
I think someone has a question first. Sierra, just posted in the chat.
Oh yeah, please, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sierra, go ahead.
Hi, I was looking through Maunakea and the island through Google Earth actually while you guys are talking, just to get a lay of the land. And I was surprised to see like how little of it is documented on Google Earth, because I could only go so far on certain roads. And part of the blockade was actually documented on Google Earth. So I was able to see the blockade, which was like definitely overdone. Like it looked like it was the security there was way too much for the amount of peaceful protesters there. And I saw a lot of other facilities on the main island of Hawaii. Like I've been to Maui, but I haven't been to the main island. So to see like the amount of facilities there was surprising. So I don't know, like how did Hawaii become such a hot spot for like laboratories like these, and how did this proliferate, and how do you get scientists to like focus on other places, because the pursuit of science is is going to be pursued no matter what. So is there any way you can get them to look at other land other than Hawaii?
So maybe I'll start with the why Maunakea is so important for astrophysicists. For a telescope works best when it's high altitude, as far above the atmosphere as you can get. So if you think about, when our stars twinkle, that's light from the stars going through our atmosphere, and we want to be as high above that as possible. So Mauna Kea is a very good site for that. It's also benefits from having a very stable weather patterns, so you actually get many good nights of observing. So those two kind of components are the main ones in my mind for this. And I think you're right about other regions. There is a lot of work in the Andes in Chile. Chile has been Hawaii has been sort of a model for how observatories work in Chile, where the Chilean universities get 10% or 20% of the time from all the observatories, and we build them there. So it has its own colonial kind of feel. There are a few other places, but there's a lot of the world where we haven't really looked. In the 2010s, there were experiments in the Arctic to look for sites that would be great for telescopes, for instance, but we never really got very far with them. So I think the best way in my mind for us to stop pushing on Mauna Kea is for us to accept that this is, Hawaiian sovereignty and Hawaiian rights to the mountain first and foremost, and we don't have consent. I think if we accept that, astronomers will look elsewhere, and I hope that when we do so, we don't just start colonizing somewhere else in the same way. I suspect we might, but one of the responses is we can go to Chile because Chileans are happy to have us, but that's also indigenous land. So there's a lot of issues anywhere we build telescopes. Perhaps you would like to add on to that.
Just briefly, since we're at time, the history of astronomy industry development in Hawaii is very long, beginning sort of in the 60s. And like we mentioned and talked through earlier, there are many telescopes on Mauna Kea presently and observatories presently. But it's important to note that the 30-meter telescope wouldn't be built at the northern summit. It actually would be built at the northern plateau. So not at the summit region where there are already observatories and telescopes. And so it would be breaking ground on land that has been untouched. And so the problem, I suppose, in this scientific pursuit is that there is competition internationally for kind of finding a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere telescope that's an extremely large telescope to triangulate. And so like Hilding was saying, there are extremely large telescopes that are being built in Chile. And there are also telescope observatories in the Canary Islands, which is the backup site for the 30-meter telescope International Observatory Corporation. And they've already gone through some processes to get permitting done, to enter into subleases for land, and have run into environmental legal challenges in La Palma, in the Canary Islands. And so I think instead of reading that as competitive, right? I'd love to like reframe the reading of how the question is, well, where can these telescopes go? How do we stop this? No one's saying that they disapprove of science, but the issue is that, as Hilding said, these extremely large telescopes have an insatiable desire for more and more and more and more land. And in this sort of global anthropocentric moment where we are in, where we're literally facing the reality of climate crisis, we need to pay attention to how even scientific technological developments like extremely large telescopes can be counter to environmental legal precedents and norms, and address that, right? Because we have this one planet, Earth, that we're living on, and there hasn't been an Earth analog found yet. But the more and more extremely large telescopes that get built, we might lose this planet even before we find that Earth analog.
Well said. So maybe we'll finish here. Actually, there's a comment made by Jewel, who actually works here at the college, earlier in the chat, which I think is to Waikea. Says, thank you kindly for the vulnerability and emotional labor it takes to educate us all of us in this space on the ongoing violence and disruption happening to your community. My hands go up to you for your energy. And I would say the same to Hilding for sharing his perspectives as an Indigenous person. We know it takes work and effort, and you're doing this all the time, and you probably feel like you're repeating yourself. So I want to thank both of you so much for being here today and for really educating us. I learned a lot, and I know other people did too. I can see in the chat. Very grateful for your time and your energy. And I'd like to thank everyone who came and took part, and your questions and discussion. So I will send everyone the link to the recording when I have it. And please feel free to pass on that link to others. So again, thanks everyone, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Mahalo again, Terry. Appreciate all the support from Okanagan College too. And to my co-conversant Hilding, it was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate your time to have it.
Thank you, Will Allen, and I appreciate our conversation. It's always educational.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to hear you both talk, and yeah. But also there's a lot. It's not always pleasant what you have to say, so there's a lot we have to take in. Myself as an astronomer, as a settler, so.
All right, great. So
I think I'll stop recording now, probably.
wonderful.
There we are.